This is part 3 of my beginner's guide to card altering series. So if you haven't checked them out already, part 1 focuses on selecting your supplies, so the types of paints to use, even selecting your primary color palette, brushes, other miscellaneous supplies. Part 2 is really just putting down this base layer. And now part 3, I think, is the most important skill for card alterists, and that is color theory, color mixing, and color matching. So in this video, we are going to start by creating a color wheel, getting comfortable mixing our paints, and then applying those paints now to the card. The paints that I will be primarily using for this video include the basics, so the carbon black and titanium white that I use for every base layer. And then for my primary colors, I'm going to focus on phthalo blue, a yellow medium, and then actually a magenta. There are some other paints I will probably use as well, so I tend to like using a sap green, and then also some sort of brown. So I have a burnt umber on hand. And then just looking at this card, we're going to be playing a lot with yellow ochre, though this is something that we're also going to mix just from our primary colors. And if you check out part 1 of this series, I do include some other brands as well that work just as fine for painting alters. But to get started, we are going to create a color wheel. And so a color wheel helps us practice mixing our primary colors to create the secondary colors. It also helps us see what are the strengths and weaknesses of the primary colors we've chosen, and then really sets the foundation for color matching. So here I've created a circle broken up into 12 spaces. So we're going to start by marking off our primary colors, which are a red, skip 3, yellow, skip 3, and a blue. And then we should have 3 in between. For my red, I am using more of a magenta color. This is just personal preference, but you can also use something like a cadmium red, which you can see has a lot warmer tones to it, or here's a primary magenta, which I would put in between these two. And in between selecting a paint, make sure to wash off your brush with some water, and then I always have either a paper towel or just a normal towel on hand to clean off the rest of the paint as well as the excess water that you get. Next color I'm using is a yellow. And then finally my blue, which is a phthalo blue. Next are the secondary colors, which are created by mixing 2 primary colors. So red and yellow will create orange. Yellow and blue will create green. And blue and red will create purple. Yellow is a much weaker color than blue, so I use more of it when mixing. So you don't need as much of the blue when creating your green. The spaces that we still have left are our tertiary colors, and you create those by mixing a primary color with a secondary color. So mixing a yellow with an orange creates a yellow-orange, or yellow with green creates a yellow-green, and we'll fill in the rest of the wheel. Now the primary red that I'm using is actually a magenta, but we can compare it to some of the other reds like a cadmium would fall right around here. So the cadmium red has more warm tones to it, where my magenta tends to fall more with cool tones. Now let's try mixing with some whites. I'm using a titanium white, which is opaque. Opaque just means less see-through, and I find that really helpful, especially with card altering, since we're trying to cover the original art or a border of the card. Adding a white to our magenta starts to create a lighter pink. Now I used a phthalo blue, which has a bit more of a warmer tone to it. Warmer just means more of the oranges, yellows, but you could also try using an ultramarine blue, which is a cooler blue. So a cooler blue would fall closer to our magenta. And similarly for yellow, you could use a primary yellow. Let's see if I have. Primary yellow, I believe, falls closer to green, at least on this color wheel, since it is a bit brighter. And the yellow I used, medium yellow, has a bit more of a warmer orange tone to it than this primary yellow does. Complementary colors are opposite to each other on the color wheel, so a red and green, an orange and a blue, yellow and purple. So I always think about sports teams or in advertising. A lot of them use these complementary colors since they look good together. But if you mix a complementary color, it reduces the intensity. So this is really helpful when creating more natural colors. And in this case, we're going to practice with creating a yellow ochre. So whenever I'm trying to match a color, I'm first going to look to see where does it best fit in the color wheel. So yellow ochre is a warm tone, it's very yellow, but you can see it's much more muted and orange than our primary yellow is. And to get that muted tone, we add a complement. So I'm going to try to match this using my primary colors, starting with yellow. I'm going to make this a bit more orange by adding magenta. And from here, I want to tone down the orange. So by doing that, I'm going to add the complement, which is our blue. And just a little bit, because I don't want it to turn too green. And if it does start turning green, I'm going to add in more of the magenta, or red, which is the complement. So we're getting pretty close there. Again, it's really just playing around with your paints until you get the right ratio of your three primary colors. If we keep mixing our primary colors, we should be able to, in theory, get to a black. Though I always just prefer, if I'm using a black, to use a carbon black. Now that we have the basics of color theory, let's go back to our card. I like to start by color blocking. So I'm looking to see what are the main color sections in the card. And you can even do this by squinting on what are the main shapes that you see. So I see a lot of this yellow ochre color. And then we have a lot of blue in the sky. So over here is a darker blue, over here is a lighter blue. And then we do fade into a darker brownish yellow, almost with some black neutral tones in it. Yellow is one of the hardest colors to match on a card, especially if we're starting with a darker border. So I'm actually going to go in by adding some titanium white to make my yellow ochre a lot more opaque and a lot brighter than I know where I'm going to end up. And this is just going to help us keep building up to color match. And your first attempt is not going to be a perfect match. Rarely it is. Oftentimes I'm just trying to get the main essence of whatever color is there, because there is so much variation in the card art. So it's not just one shade of yellow here. We have really light yellows. We have this more orangey yellow ochre that's speckled within. So I try to match the lightest color that I see, or at least work up to that color. So we're gonna let this dry. We're gonna come back to it later. But while it's drying, let's start working on the sky. So there's two main sections I see to the sky. The first is this lighter blue, then the other is this darker blue that has a cooler tone to it. So I definitely see a little more magenta in this blue here. So let's start by trying to generally match this lighter color. Starting with my phthalo blue, I can see that it is too dark, so I am going to add some white. And this is much too vibrant for the card, so I am going to, I know, add a little bit of magenta. I'd probably still add some white. And it's actually a bit more purple. Let's just see what happens if we put this paint down. So sometimes it's nice just to try putting it down, and then you can really see where you're at. So to create purple, we're just going to keep adding our magenta. Especially for this side over here, it's a little bit of a darker blue with our magenta. And again, sometimes it's helpful just to put the paint down and see where we're at. And it's going to fade to a lighter color, so I'm just going to start adding in a bit more white as we get to the left side of the card. And again, this is just a really rough color block to become more comfortable with what we're dealing with in the card. We're still not quite there yet with the sky, but let's let that dry and start working back on these yellow ochre fields. So what I'm going to try to do is match this light muted yellow on the top, the lightest color, and bring it down, because it's much easier to start with the lightest color and then build in all of this texture. So here I'm using the yellow ochre that we mixed. I added a bit more yellow to it, and I'm also adding some titanium white. So we've just about matched at least the brightness of that light yellow, so I'm going to start going in with more of that true orange yellow ochre to start color matching. So I'm just going to generally try to match this light blackish magenta color. Let's see where we're at. Now that it's dried, it's easier for me to see that my blue here is a little bit too saturated, so I'm gonna have to lighten that up a little bit. I think it needs a little bit more of a purple tone to it, and then over here we definitely need to lighten that up. I'm going to start going in some of the transition areas, so that includes these little trees that we can see here, the mountains up here, which are a more muted purple. Looks like down here it's that same purple color. And then we have a little bit of green that we're going to start bringing in. Now I'm just going in with some of the details, so I'm in some blades of grass. And this is just using an old brush that's pretty frayed. Once we're done with the details, I then go in with a toothpick just to clean up some of the paint around the borders. Once the card completely dries, you can finish with a varnish. My favorite, I like using an aerosol varnish, usually a satin finish. Otherwise, you could try using a liquid varnish as well. I find these look a little bit more sticky. I just can't get a really smooth application, so I tend to go with an aerosol. I'm not going to show that part today. I usually take my cards outside when I apply the varnish. It's a really windy day, so it's not the best day for me to go out and do that, but I'll definitely have another video showing how to apply these varnishes.